Okay, let's go. Number 1. Pompeii and Herculaneum. The year is 1863. You're an excavator working under Giuseppe Fiorelli at a Roman ruin near Naples, and your trowel has just opened into empty space where there should be solid, compacted ash. You know what this means. You've done it before. You mix plaster and pour it carefully through the small opening, filling a hollow that has held its shape inside the hardened volcanic debris for close to 1,800 years. You wait for the plaster to set. Then you dig the surrounding ash away, and a human being rises out of the ground. Not a skeleton, a full figure, curled on its side, one arm raised toward its face in the last motion it ever made, the folds of its clothing still visible in the hardened plaster. This is Pompeii, and it didn't just get buried slowly. It got caught, completely, in the act. On August 24th, 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted above the Bay of Naples, and the eyewitness account survives because a teenager named Pliny the Younger wrote it down years later in 2 letters to the historian Tacitus, describing a cloud shaped like an umbrella pine, ash falling like snow across the bay, tremors strong enough to rock ships at anchor, and the death of his own uncle, Pliny the Elder, who sailed a naval squadron toward the eruption to rescue people and never sailed back. For the first, longer phase of the eruption, Pompeii had time. Ash and pumice rained down for hours, giving residents a real window to flee, and a majority of the population, estimated between 12,000 and 15,000 people, appears to have escaped the city entirely, fleeing along roads now buried under the same ash that preserved everything else. Roughly 2,000 bodies have been recovered at Pompeii itself, out of a population that mostly got out. Here's where it gets strange. The people who died weren't caught by falling ash. They were killed by what came after it, a pyroclastic surge, a superheated cloud of gas, and pulverized volcanic material racing down the mountainside at highway speed, reaching temperatures researchers estimate as high as 500 degrees Fahrenheit on contact. Forensic analysis of the victims shows death was near instantaneous, muscles contracting from extreme heat into the flexed, defensive postures preserved in the plaster casts, arms raised, knees drawn in, not from panic, but from the body's final involuntary reaction to catastrophic heat. Fiorelli's casting technique, refined over decades of excavation, has since produced more than 100 identifiable human forms. A dog still chained in a doorway, a family gathered together in a locked room, a man alone with his hands pressed flat against his face, 2 figures long assumed to be a mother and daughter embracing, later analysis suggesting they may not have been related at all, strangers who simply reached for each other in the same final second. Herculaneum, a smaller and wealthier town closer to the volcano, tells a different version of the same story. For nearly 2 centuries, almost no bodies were found there, leading historians to assume its population had successfully escaped by boat before the worst of the eruption reached them. Then, in the 1980s, excavators clearing the ancient shoreline found more than 300 skeletons packed into stone boat chambers along the beach. People who had run for the water, sheltered exactly where they believed they'd be safest, and waited for ships that arrived too late or never arrived at all. Skull fractures and skeletal evidence consistent with instant extreme heat exposure confirmed they died in place, together, facing the sea they never reached. What disturbs researchers most isn't the death toll, it's the timing gap. Pompeii's victims had hours of warning and thousands used it well. The ones who stayed weren't uniformly the sick, the elderly, or the enslaved forced to remain behind, though many of the dead were. Wealthy households, armed guards, people carrying purses full of coins and fine jewelry were found among the dead, meaning some who had every resource available to leave chose instead to wait, gambling that the worst had already passed, or that their homes and stored belongings were worth one more night's risk. That gamble had roughly an 18-hour window between the 2 eruption phases, and Vesuvius never gave a second warning for the one that killed them. Neither city was ever rebuilt on top of, which sets both apart sharply from nearly every other destroyed settlement in the ancient Mediterranean, where new construction routinely buried the old within a generation or 2 of any disaster. Pompeii and Herculaneum simply stayed buried, sealed, untouched for over 16 centuries, until treasure hunters began tunneling into Herculaneum in the 1700s, and organized excavation began at Pompeii shortly after. Modern forensic work has gone further still, extracting DNA and even attempting facial reconstructions from several of the plaster cast victims, turning anonymous huddled shapes back into specific people with specific last moments. Today, both sites remain among the most completely preserved windows into daily Roman life anywhere on Earth. Bakeries with carbonized loaves still sitting in the oven, political graffiti still legible on tavern walls, a midday meal left half-eaten on a table, a city interrupted mid-sentence and never resumed. Vesuvius caught everyone who stayed and preserved the proof standing exactly where they fell. 15 centuries earlier, a different Aegean eruption gave an entire town enough warning to get away completely, and what that town left behind turned out to be even harder to explain than a body ever could. Number 2. Akrotiri. The year is 1967. You're brushing volcanic ash from a wall on a Greek island called Thera, and a painted eye is staring back at you. Blue-gray, almond-shaped, rimmed in dark ochre, part of a life-size fresco of a young man carrying strings of fish, and it has been sealed in darkness for roughly 3,600 years. The air down here is cool and completely still, sealed off from the Aegean sun above. No insects, no wind, just the sound of your own brush against stone and your own breathing. Your name is Spiridon Marinatos. You've spent your entire career chasing a theory nobody wanted to fund, that this quiet island once hosted an advanced Bronze Age town, and that its sudden, violent destruction rippled outward far enough to end civilizations hundreds of miles away. You dig another foot down. A second building appears, then a street, then a drainage system running beneath multi-story houses that shouldn't exist this early in human history. This is Akrotiri, and it is unlike any other buried city on Earth, not because of what you're finding, but because of what you are not. Akrotiri sat on the southern coast of Thera, the island now called Santorini, a thriving Minoan-era port town of narrow streets and three-story buildings decorated floor to ceiling with frescoes, boxing children, blue monkeys, a fleet of ships crossing open water rendered in astonishing detail. The town had running water, sealed drainage, and separate hot and cold plumbing lines, technology that would not become common in Europe again for another 3,000 years. Sometime around 1600 BC, the volcano beneath the island erupted with a force estimated at multiple times the intensity of Krakatoa, one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history, burying the town under nearly 26 feet of pumice and ash within a matter of days. That eruption is also, in archaeological terms, the reason Akrotiri exists at all today, sealed, airtight, and almost perfectly intact beneath its own destruction. Marinatos and the excavators who followed him, including Christos Dumas, uncovered room after room exactly as it had been left. Storage jars still lined up in rows along interior walls. Furniture positions preserved as negative space in the hardened ash, allowing plaster casts of wooden beds, tables, and even a wooden chest, objects that had long since rotted away, leaving only their exact shape behind in the ash like a mold. Some rooms show clear signs of hasty repair, cracked walls braced with new masonry, collapsed roof material pushed aside and stacked, evidence of a sequence of earthquakes striking in the days or weeks before the final, catastrophic eruption. The town knew something was coming. The town prepared for it, and then the town left. Here's where it gets strange. Pompeii, buried a millennium and a half later, under similar volcanic ash, yielded roughly 2,000 human bodies, some frozen mid-flight, some huddled together in final shelter, their exact final postures preserved in plaster. Akrotiri has yielded none. Not one confirmed human skeleton has been recovered across more than 5 decades of excavation, covering roughly 3 acres of the town, an excavated footprint large enough that a mass grave of any real size would almost certainly have surfaced by now. No bodies along the roads leading inland, no bodies clustered near the harbor. Gold jewelry was found undisturbed in at least one building, meaning looters didn't clear the town afterward, and meaning the residents themselves didn't take everything of value with them either. They left in enough of a hurry to abandon gold. They left with enough warning to take themselves. The foreshock earthquakes gave the people of Akrotiri a window, likely days, possibly only hours, and archaeologists broadly agree they used it to evacuate by sea, the only realistic escape route from an island. What isn't agreed on, what may never be agreed on, is where they went. No mass burial exists anywhere on Thera. No confirmed shipwreck fleet has been located in the surrounding waters, matching that specific, sudden evacuation. Ancient Aegean populations were mobile and coastal towns absorbed refugees constantly, so a scattered population folding invisibly into neighboring islands isn't implausible. It is, however, unconfirmed, and it leaves an entire functioning town's worth of residents, generating no physical trace of where, exactly, they came ashore. The volcano didn't erupt once and stop. Researchers studying the eruption sequence argue it unfolded across days to weeks in escalating phases, meaning it's possible some of Akrotiri's population was still at sea, or only newly resettled somewhere else, when the final and most violent explosive phase detonated, an eruption powerful enough that its ash has been chemically matched to sediment layers in Greenland ice cores and Nile Delta soil more than 800 miles away. If any of them looked back toward Thera during that final phase, there was nothing left on the island behind them to return to. Akrotiri remains one of the best preserved Bronze Age sites on Earth, walkable today beneath a modern protective roof, its frescoes vivid enough that the blue in the monkey paintings still reads as blue. The red in the antelope paintings still reads as blood-warm. Some researchers have gone further, linking Akrotiri and Thera's destruction to the Atlantis legend recorded centuries later by Plato, an advanced island civilization erased in a single catastrophic event. The connection remains speculative and heavily debated, but the underlying facts it's built on, a sophisticated maritime culture, a sudden and total disappearance, are not speculative at all. Those parts are excavated, catalogued, and sitting under glass a short walk from where you'd be standing. Excavation continues on less than half the estimated footprint of the ancient town. What lies in the unexcavated sections, whether it changes anything about an empty city with no dead, is unknown. Did they scatter across a dozen islands and simply vanish into other people's histories? Did some of them never make landfall at all? For now, the record stands exactly as it has for 3,600 years, a town packed and gone, its valuables mostly left behind, its dead nowhere to be found, its people vanished into the wider Aegean world, so completely that history simply lost them. Akrotiri's people vanished ahead of a disaster nobody could have stopped. The next city on this list wasn't undone by the earth at all. It was undone by the people who had lived inside its walls their entire lives. Number 3. Mayapan. You're an archaeologist, working a residential compound near the center of a walled Maya city in the Yucatan Peninsula, brushing back a layer of ash that has sat undisturbed for centuries, and the burn pattern underneath your trowel doesn't look like an accident at all. The support posts show char consistent with a fire set at the base, deliberately, on multiple sides of the structure at once. Nearby, a family crypt built into the floor of an elite residence has been broken open, its contents scattered, disturbed by someone who wanted the people buried there disrespected, not simply robbed. You are standing in Mayapan, the last great capital of the Maya world before Spanish contact, and this one did not fade away over generations. It was torn down from the inside, on purpose, by people who had lived inside its walls their entire lives. Mayapan rose to become the dominant political center of the northern Yucatan in the aftermath of the earlier collapse of the classic Maya cities to the south, a walled city enclosed by more than 5.5 miles of defensive fortification, housing an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people at its peak, governed through a confederation of noble lineages under the leadership of the Kokam dynasty. For roughly 2.5 centuries, from around 1200 AD, Mayapan functioned as the closest thing the post-classic Maya world had to a unified capital, its walled center encircling more than 4,000 densely packed structures, temples, a market, and the residential compounds of the elite families who ran the confederation alongside the Kokam. Here's where it gets strange, though for Mayapan the strangeness isn't a mystery about a hidden cause, it's how well documented the horror actually is. Colonial-era Spanish chronicler Diego de Landa, compiling Maya oral history in the 16th century, recorded that the Kokam's dominance had grown resented and tyrannical, relying in part on foreign mercenaries to maintain control over the other noble lineages. According to that same tradition, a rival lineage, the Shu, allied with several other resentful noble houses, led a rebellion sometime in the mid-1400s that ended in the massacre of the Kokam ruling family inside their own palace compound, sparing, according to the account, Only one member, who happened to be away trading in Honduras at the time, and returned to find his entire family gone. Archaeological work at the site over the following century, led first by the Carnegie Institution of Washington and continued by Mexican and American researchers since, has largely corroborated the broad strokes of that account. Burned elite residences concentrated in specific areas of the city, a desecrated royal tomb, and an abrupt, total cessation of construction and maintenance immediately following the destruction layer. What makes Mayapan stand out is the clarity of intent behind its ending, documented in enough independent detail that historians can name the factions involved. This wasn't drought forcing a slow retreat or a natural disaster no one could have prevented. Excavated burn patterns concentrated specifically on elite residential and ceremonial structures, largely sparing more modest housing elsewhere in the walled city, are consistent with a targeted purge rather than an indiscriminate disaster, an uprising that knew exactly which buildings it wanted to destroy and which people it wanted found in the ruins. The city's population dispersed almost immediately afterward, bore two smaller, competing city-states across the Yucatan, some 17 or more separate polities by the time European contact began, none of which ever grew large enough to reunify the region the way Mayapan had. When Spanish conquistadors arrived roughly a century later, they encountered exactly that fractured political landscape, and some scholars argue the divided, easily picked-off polities they found were a direct, lingering consequence of Mayapan's violent implosion generations earlier. Some excavated skeletal remains from the destruction layer show evidence of violent trauma consistent with close combat rather than execution alone, suggesting parts of the uprising involved genuine fighting rather than a single clean purge. The walled city itself was never resettled at anything close to its former scale. Its temples and residential compounds stand today as one of the best-preserved post-classic Maya sites in the Yucatan, studied extensively by the Carnegie Institution in the early 20th century and by Mexican and international archaeological teams since. The burned floors and the broken tomb still exactly where the rebellion left them centuries ago. Did the single surviving Kokum noble, spared only by the accident of being away on business, ever return to see what had been done to his family? Did the Shu who led the purge understand, in the moment, that they weren't just ending a dynasty but ending the last real chance at a unified Maya political center before outsiders arrived from across the ocean? And how much of what followed a century later, conquest, colonization, a fractured people unable to present a unified resistance, traces back to a single night of targeted, documented violence inside one city's own walls? Mayapan's fall was witnessed, remembered, and written down by the very people who caused it. The next place on this list left behind its own record of its final hours too, written by someone still inside the walls in the moments before the fire finished the sentence for them. Number 4. Ugarit. The year is 1929. You're a French archaeologist named Claude Schaeffer, sifting through the ruins of a royal archive room in a mound on the Syrian coast called Ras Shamra, and you've just found something that shouldn't exist in its current form. It's a clay tablet, covered in a wedge-shaped script nobody has fully classified yet, and it is hard, almost stone-hard, in a way unbaked clay tablets from this period never are. This tablet was never meant to be fired. Someone was still writing it, wet clay, under a stylus, when the building around them caught fire and baked it permanently in place. You are holding the last words of Ugarit, hardened by the very disaster that ended it, a message frozen mid-sentence by the same fire it was warning about. Ugarit was one of the great trading city-states of the Late Bronze Age, a port linking Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Cyprus, and Mycenaean Greece in a dense, prosperous web of maritime commerce that had functioned for centuries, its harbor at nearby Minet el Beida handling shipments of copper, textiles, wine, and timber bound for palaces hundreds of miles in every direction. Its scribes developed one of the world's earliest alphabetic writing systems, a cuneiform alphabet of roughly 30 signs pressed into wet clay, and its archives preserved everything from royal correspondence and trade contracts to the region's great mythological epics, including the Baal cycle, one of the oldest surviving bodies of Canaanite religious literature. By the 13th century BC, Ugarit was wealthy, fortified, and thoroughly embedded in the diplomatic network of the ancient Near East. exchanging letters with kings from Egypt to Anatolia and hosting resident merchants and diplomats from across the region within its own walls. Then, within a span most archaeologists now place at just a few years, around 1190 to 1185 BC, it was destroyed, burned, and never significantly reoccupied, its exact location lost until a farmer's plow struck an ancient tomb in 1928, and Schaefer's excavation began the following year. Here's where it gets strange. Among the tablets recovered from the Royal Palace archive are letters written in the city's final months, and they read like a countdown. One, from Ugarit's last king, Amurapi, to the ruler of Cyprus, describes enemy ships already sighted along the coast and pleads for military assistance that, as far as the archaeological record shows, never arrived in time. Another tablet, addressed to the same king, describes enemy vessels burning towns in the surrounding region and warns that the threat is closing in on Ugarit itself. A separate letter has Amurapi himself reporting that his own army and chariots are away, deployed elsewhere at the request of the Hittite king, leaving the city without its usual defensive forces at the exact moment the danger arrived. These aren't later historical summaries. They are contemporary, first-person emergency correspondence, preserved by accident because the very fire that ended the correspondence also hardened the clay it was written on. Who exactly ended Ugarit, and how quickly it actually happened once the enemy ships arrived, remains genuinely debated. Ancient Egyptian records from the same general era describe a loose coalition of seaborne raiders. Modern scholars call the Sea Peoples, sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean, and for decades that was treated as the simple answer. More recent research complicates it. Ugarit's destruction sits at the center of the broader Late Bronze Age collapse, a systems failure across multiple Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations occurring within the same general span of a few decades, and current scholarship increasingly points to a compounding disaster rather than a single villain. Drought and famine straining, food supplies, earthquake damage, weakening infrastructure, trade networks breaking down, and opportunistic raiders arriving to finish off societies already destabilized by everything else. Ugarit may not have fallen to one enemy. It may have fallen to all of them, arriving in roughly the same terrible window. What isn't debated is the totality of the end. Excavated destruction layers across the site, in some places over 3 feet thick, show widespread burning, collapsed fortification walls, and scattered bronze arrowheads consistent with violent conflict in the city's final days. Unburied skeletal remains found in the streets and doorways of several excavated houses suggest at least some residents died where they fell, with no one left afterward to recover or bury them. Ugarit was never rebuilt as a major settlement. A civilization with centuries of accumulated wealth, diplomatic connections stretching across the known world, and enough warning to write increasingly desperate letters for help still could not save itself, and whatever finally broke through did so completely enough that an entire trading empire simply stopped existing within a matter of years, its name gone from history until a farmer's plow found it again 3,000 years later. Why didn't help arrive? Why, with letters describing the danger weeks or months in advance, could nothing be organized in time? And if a city this wealthy, this connected, and this forewarned still couldn't survive whatever was approaching that year, what does that say about everyone else caught in the same collapse who had far less warning than Ugarit did? Ugarit's scribes at least got to write down that something was coming before it arrived. Half a world away, and centuries later, a desert canyon's people left no letters at all, only bones that raise a question letters can't answer. What do you do when the threat isn't sailing toward you from the sea, but living in the room next door? Number 5. Chaco Canyon. The year is 1896. You're an expedition archaeologist walking through room after room of a massive stone complex in a remote desert canyon in northwestern New Mexico, and you have lost count somewhere past 600. This is Pueblo Bonito, a D-shaped great house rising 4 stories in places, containing kivas, storage rooms, and ceremonial chambers built with a level of masonry precision and astronomical alignment that took generations of the ancestral Puebloan people to construct, expand, and continually refine. Its stonework built up from tens of thousands of individually shaped sandstone pieces set into distinct decorative banding patterns visible on the walls today. The building's outer wall faces true south, with an accuracy modern surveyors using satellite equipment still study closely, off by only a fraction of a degree across a wall hundreds of feet long. Its internal walls incorporate solar and lunar alignments, tracking cycles that repeat only once every 18.6 years, a pattern that required sustained, careful, multi-generational skywatching to even notice in the first place, let alone deliberately build stone architecture around. Someone here was watching the sky with extraordinary patience. And then, within the span of a few decades, they stopped building, stopped watching, and left. Chaco Canyon served as the political, ceremonial, and likely economic center of the ancestral Puebloan world from roughly 850 to 1150 AD, a hub connected by an extensive network of engineered roads running arrow straight across the desert to outlying communities dozens of miles away, roads wide enough for coordinated group travel and, in places, cut directly through solid rock rather than routed around it. Some of these roads run for miles without any obvious destination at all, straight lines pointed at distant mesas or empty horizon, their purpose more ceremonial than practical by any modern engineering logic. Pueblo Bonito alone contains more than 600 rooms, and represents one of the largest buildings constructed anywhere in North America before the 19th century. Tree ring dating, using the region's exceptionally well-preserved ponderosa pine roof beams, allows researchers to date construction phases with remarkable year-by-year precision, and that same tree ring record documents something else with equal precision. A series of severe droughts striking the region beginning in the mid-1100s, part of what climatologists now call the Great Drought, a multi-decade dry period documented across the American Southwest through both tree ring and geological sediment evidence. Here's where it gets strange. Drought alone explains crop failure. It doesn't fully explain what physical anthropologist Christy Turner documented at several sites connected to the Chaco cultural sphere: extensive cut marks, deliberate burning, and bone breakage patterns on human remains consistent, in Turner's controversial but rigorously argued analysis, with processing typically associated with cannibalism. Turner's conclusions remain genuinely contested within archaeology, with some researchers proposing alternative explanations, including ritual mortuary practices or extreme interpersonal violence, without cannibalism specifically involved. What isn't contested is the underlying violence itself. The skeletal trauma is real, extensive, and concentrated in a specific window overlapping the region's collapse. Something at the end of the Chaco system's dominance turned violent, internally, among communities that had spent centuries building monumental architecture together in apparent cooperation. Construction at Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses ceased abruptly in the 1100s. Outlying communities that had been architecturally and economically tied to Chaco for generations broke away or were abandoned outright within the same narrow window. Population shifted north and east, toward the Mesa Verde region and eventually the Rio Grande Valley, where new communities absorbed migrants carrying Chacoan ritual knowledge and architectural traditions forward, even as the canyon itself emptied out behind them. Some outlying great houses show evidence of deliberate, ceremonial closure, rather than simple neglect. Doorways, formally sealed with stone and mortar, roof beams pulled and burned in what looks less like abandonment and more like a funeral for a building. Modern Puebloan oral tradition, maintained by descendant communities including the Hopi and several Rio Grande Pueblo nations, treats Chaco Canyon as a sacred but no longer permanently inhabited place, a site of pilgrimage and historical origin, rather than a home anyone is meant to return to and resettle. What resists easy explanation is the combination. A multi-decade drought is a survivable, if brutal, environmental pressure that ancestral Puebloan communities had weathered before across their long occupation of the Southwest. What appears different at the end of the Chaco era is evidence of violence turned inward, communities that had cooperated for generations on an astronomically precise, labor-intensive building project apparently turning on each other as the system's central authority weakened and resources tightened. Whether the violence caused the final collapse or the collapse triggered the violence is a sequence archaeologists still argue over, working from a fixed set of bones and beam dates that refuse to offer a cleaner answer. Some of the affected remains were found not in graves but scattered across room floors and in ventilation shafts, discarded rather than buried, a detail that even skeptics of Turner's full interpretation struggle to explain through ritual practice alone. What was it like inside the canyon in those final years, when the sky watching stopped and something else took over? Chaco's people didn't just leave the canyon. Many of them went north, into cliffs, into houses built where enemies could no longer easily reach them, a slow, generation-long retreat from something they never wrote down. Not every ending on this list took that long. One took a single night. Number 6. Helike. The year is 2001. You're a geologist named Dora Katsanopoulou, standing on a flat coastal plain in the northern Peloponnese, and you've spent close to 2 decades chasing a city that most classical scholars filed under mythology. Your drilling team pulls up a sediment core from beneath what is now a shallow lagoon near the Gulf of Corinth, and inside it are fragments of painted pottery, sections of roof tile, and the corner of a wall foundation, all dated to the classical period, all sitting under distinct layers of marine sand that shouldn't be there unless the ground itself had once dropped and let the sea rush in. You are looking at the confirmed physical remains of Helike, a city that ancient writers insisted sank into the earth in a single night, and that modern scholars spent 2,000 years quietly assuming was exaggeration, piled onto a forgettable earthquake somewhere in the region's long, seismically restless history. Helike was a prosperous city of the Achaean League, home to a major temple of Poseidon and, according to multiple ancient sources, the very city from which the founders of Ionian Helike, in what is now western Turkey, traced their ancestral origin. In the winter of 373 BC, on a single night that ancient historians agreed on with unusual consistency across otherwise independent sources, they recorded its total destruction. Strabo, writing 3 centuries later, described the city disappearing beneath the earth in a single night. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century AD, said the sea swallowed it so completely that its walls could still be seen underwater, submerged and intact, for generations afterward. Diodorus Siculus, writing independently, attached a specific sequence to events. A violent earthquake followed almost immediately by a wave that overran the low-lying city before most residents could reach higher ground. Ancient sailors, according to multiple surviving accounts, reported catching their fishing nets on a bronze statue of Poseidon still standing upright on the drowned seafloor, centuries after the city itself had passed from memory into legend. Roman-era travelers reportedly organized boat trips specifically to view the submerged ruins through the shallow water, treating the drowned city as a tourist curiosity long before archaeology existed as a discipline capable of studying it properly. Here's where it gets strange. For most of the last 2,000 years, Helike's disappearance was treated as a moral fable, not a historical event. Ancient sources claimed the city's destruction was divine punishment, that Helike's residents had violently turned away a group of suppliants who sought sanctuary at the temple of Poseidon, and that the god drowned the entire city in direct response. Scholars for centuries dismissed the sinking itself as poetic embellishment, layered onto a real but far less dramatic earthquake. It took Katsanopoulou's Helike project, combining geophysical surveying with direct excavations starting in the 1990s, to establish that the ancient sources had the underlying mechanism essentially correct, even while getting the explanation entirely wrong. A major earthquake did strike the coastal plain that winter. It did trigger soil liquefaction, turning the saturated ground beneath the city temporarily fluid, and structures didn't just crack under the shaking, they sank, in places by several feet, in a matter of minutes, while a resulting tsunami surged in from the Gulf and finished what the earthquake started. The excavation confirmed building remains, paved roads, and dense artifact layers directly beneath and interspersed with tsunami-deposited sand, exactly the physical signature the ancient descriptions implied, without having the geological vocabulary to name it. The city hadn't been swallowed by an angry god. It had been swallowed by liquefaction, a phenomenon well documented in modern earthquake zones, where saturated coastal soil briefly behaves like a liquid under violent shaking, and anything built directly on top of it simply drops, sometimes within seconds. Helike sat on exactly that kind of ground, close to the coast, adjacent to a river delta, saturated year-round by groundwater. It was, geologically speaking, close to the worst possible place to build a city meant to survive a major earthquake. What still isn't fully resolved is the fate of the population itself. Ancient accounts describe near total loss of the city's residents, a claim that, if fully accurate, would make Helike one of the deadliest single-night disasters recorded anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean. Some later historians point to the Ionian colonists, who trace their line back to survivors who fled before or during the disaster, suggesting the death toll may have been exaggerated by writers working centuries after the fact for dramatic and moralizing effect. Excavation at the site continues today, layer by layer, and the actual number of Helike residents lost that night, against the number who escaped inland in the earthquake's opening moments, remains a question the sediment hasn't finished answering. How many made it out? How many didn't even know to run? And what, exactly, was the Temple of Poseidon doing at the moment the ground gave way beneath it? A building dedicated to the very god ancient writers blamed for the destruction, gone in the same instant as everything around it. Helike disappeared into the earth in a single night and stayed lost for 2,000 years because nobody believed the story that had been telling the truth the entire time. Across the sea, a different palace's last night wasn't hidden by water. It was preserved, word for word, by the very fire that ended it. Number 7. Pylos Palace of Nestor. The year is 1939. You're an American archaeologist named Carl Blagan, and on the very first day of test excavation on a low hill in southwestern Greece, your team's shovels hit something unexpected barely inches below the surface, fragments of clay tablets covered in an unknown script. Within weeks, you've recovered hundreds more, an entire government's worth of records dug out of a single collapsed room. The tablets should not have survived 3,000 years in the ground. Raw, unfired clay dissolves. These didn't dissolve because something baked them solid before the earth ever had the chance to break them down. An enormous fire, hot enough and sustained enough to fire an entire palace's paperwork like pottery, on the same day it burned the palace to the ground. This is Pylos, later identified through the Homeric tradition as the legendary kingdom of Nestor, one of the major administrative centers of Mycenaean Greece during the Late Bronze Age, and Blagan's discovery came on the very first day he broke ground. In the very first trench his team dug, an almost impossible stroke of archaeological luck. Blagan's excavations, continuing over subsequent seasons, uncovered a sprawling palace complex with a monumental columned entrance, a throne room decorated with painted griffins and lions facing a central hearth, extensive storage magazines still containing thousands of intact wine and oil vessels stacked exactly where they'd been shelved, and, crucially, an archive room positioned near the entrance where the palace's Linear B clay tablets were kept, an administrative record system tracking everything from grain shipments and textile production to military rosters and religious offerings. Around 1180 BC, give or take a couple of decades depending on the specific chronology researchers favor, that palace burned to the ground in a single catastrophic fire, intense enough to vitrify sections of mud brick wall into something closer to glass, and was never rebuilt. Here's where it gets strange. Among the surviving tablets are records that read less like routine bureaucracy and more like the last preparations of a government bracing for an attack. Several tablets describe the organization of rowers being dispatched to the coast, and others describe watchers being posted to guard specific stretches of shoreline. Defensive assignments that suggest the palace's administration believed, in its final weeks or months, that a threat was approaching by sea and needed to be met before it reached the palace itself. One tablet, sometimes called the OKA series by researchers, lists specific named commanders and unit sizes assigned to 10 separate coastal watch stations, a level of organizational detail suggesting the threat was considered specific and imminent rather than a vague, generalized fear. Whether that threat ever arrived in the form the Pylians expected, or whether the fire that ultimately destroyed the palace came from an entirely different direction, internal unrest, an accident, an earthquake igniting oil stores, or some combination, none of the tablets fully explain, remains one of the most argued questions in Bronze Age archaeology. Pylos did not fall alone, and that wider regional pattern is a large part of why the mystery here has never fully closed. Its destruction sits within the same general window as the collapse of Mycenae, Tiryns, and other major Mycenaean palatial centers across Greece, a wave of destruction spanning roughly a generation that ended the entire Mycenaean palatial system and ushered in a centuries-long period of demographic decline, reduced trade, and lost literacy, now sometimes called the Greek Dark Ages. Writing itself, in the Linear B form used at Pylos, disappeared from Greece for roughly 400 years afterward, meaning the very fire that destroyed the palace also destroyed, for the practical purposes of everyday continuity, the ability to read and write administratively at this level of sophistication anywhere in the region. Decades later, in 1952, a British architect and amateur linguist named Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B using tablets recovered from Pylos and the Cretan site of Knossos, proving definitively that the language recorded in that hardened, fire-baked clay was an early form of Greek, centuries older than anyone had previously confirmed a Greek-speaking, literate civilization to exist. Ventris died in a car accident only 4 years after his breakthrough, without ever fully seeing how thoroughly his decoded script would reshape the study of Bronze Age Greece. The palace's destruction had inadvertently handed modern scholars their clearest window into the world that destruction ended. What were the rowers and coastal watchers actually preparing for, and did it come? Was the fire, the attack itself, or something else entirely, arriving in the chaos of a wider regional collapse that Pylos' own administrators may not have fully understood was already underway? And if a government sophisticated enough to organize coastal defense assignments down to individual watchposts still couldn't prevent its own capital from burning to the ground, what chance did anyone with less warning have? Pylos left behind a government's final paperwork, preserved by the same fire that ended it. Across an ocean and roughly 2,000 years later, a different fortified home left behind something quieter, a full pantry, swept floors, and no explanation at all for why nobody ever came back to eat the corn. Number 8. Cliff Palace, Mesa Verde. The year is 1888. You're a rancher named Richard Wetherill, riding across a snow-dusted mesa in southwestern Colorado with your brother-in-law Charlie Mason, searching for stray cattle, when you look across a canyon through falling snow and stop your horse completely. Built into a massive sandstone alcove on the opposite cliff face is an entire stone city. Towers, rooms stacked upon rooms, kivas sunk into the alcove floor, all of it tucked so deeply under the overhanging rock that centuries of weather simply passed over the top of it without ever touching the walls beneath. You are looking at Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America, and it has been sitting here, essentially untouched by human hands, since the people who built it walked away sometime in the late 1200s. Its plastered walls and painted designs still holding their color after 6 centuries under the same protective overhang. Cliff Palace contains more than 150 rooms and 23 kivas, built by ancestral Puebloan people into a natural alcove roughly 90 feet high and hundreds of feet wide, high enough on the cliff face that access required climbing carved hand and toe holds or wooden ladders that residents could pull up behind themselves at will, sealing off the entire settlement from anyone approaching from below. Tree ring dating of construction timbers shows the vast majority of Cliff Palace's building activity happened within an extremely narrow window, concentrated in the final decades before abandonment, a burst of intensive, labor-heavy construction rather than the slow, multi-generational growth seen at earlier ancestral Puebloan sites nearby, most of it dated to between roughly 1260 and 1280 AD, barely 20 years of frantic building before the alcove went permanently silent. People here weren't just settling in for the long term. They were fortifying, hard and fast, right up until the moment they left the entire complex behind. Here's where it gets strange. When archaeologists began systematically documenting Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings starting in the early 1900s under the direction of Jesse Walter Fuchs, they didn't find empty rooms waiting for them. They found corn still stored in ceramic jars, tools left in place on swept floors, whole pottery vessels sitting undisturbed, exactly where their last owners had set them down. Entire households worth of belongings, the kind of items a family relocating voluntarily and gradually would almost certainly pack and carry with them, were simply left behind in place. Across the wider Mesa Verde region and the connected Four Corners area, archaeological survey shows the entire zone. Once home to tens of thousands of ancestral Puebloan people, spread across hundreds of separate communities, was depopulated within a span most researchers place at a single human generation, roughly 1275 to 1300 AD. The architecture itself argues against a simple climate-only story. Cliff Palace and its neighboring dwellings weren't just built for shelter, they were built for defense, positioned in alcoves accessible only by climbing routes that could be blocked or defended by very few people against a much larger approaching force, features that make little practical sense as a response to drought alone. Drought explains why people might need to move. It explains far less about why they needed to move somewhere this specific, this defensible, and this labor-intensive to construct, in the exact years immediately, before leaving it behind for good and never coming back. The tree ring record confirms the Great Drought hit this region with real severity, but Mesa Verde's people had already survived earlier dry periods without retreating into fortified cliffsides carved into sheer rock. Something else was clearly layered on top of the water shortage. Regional archaeological evidence from this period, including increased signs of conflict and violence at multiple Four Corners sites, contemporaneous with the Chaco cultural sphere's collapse discussed earlier on this list, suggests the drought didn't operate in isolation at all, but as one pressure feeding directly into another. Competition for dwindling arable land and shrinking water sources, in a region already under severe environmental stress, appears to have escalated into exactly the kind of conflict that would explain both the defensive architecture and the totality of the eventual, near-simultaneous abandonment. Descendant Puebloan communities, including the Hopi and several Rio Grande Pueblos, maintain migration narratives describing this specific period as one of hardship, forced movement, and the deliberate closing of a chapter rather than a place anyone intended to return to. Narratives passed down orally, with enough internal consistency that archaeologists now treat them as a genuine historical source in their own right. Cliff Palace stands today within Mesa Verde National Park, its corn storage jars and abandoned tools long since removed to museum collections for preservation, but its walls, towers, and kivas remain exactly where they were built, in an alcove that kept them nearly invisible to outsiders for over 600 years, protecting a home its people fortified, filled with everything they owned, and then left all at once, never to return. Later, Puebloan builders across the Southwest never again constructed cliff dwellings at anywhere near this scale, as if the strategy itself had been tried once, at its absolute limit, and found to still not be enough. The Four Corners emptied within a single generation, its people chased out gradually by drought and, quite possibly, by each other. The next place on this list wasn't chased out by anything living at all. The ground itself simply gave way, one piece at a time, until an entire port city was gone. Number 9. Thonis-Heracleion. The year is 2000. You're underwater in Abu Qir Bay, off the coast of Egypt, roughly 4 miles from the modern shoreline, and your dive light has just swept across a face carved from red granite, larger than a bus, half buried in silt on the sea floor and staring straight up through 20 feet of murky, current-stirred water. You are Franck Gaudio, a French marine archaeologist who has spent years surveying this exact stretch of the Mediterranean based on ancient texts describing a lost port city, and the face belongs to a colossal statue that hasn't seen sunlight in over 1,000 years. Around it, as your team's sonar and excavation continue over the following months and then years, an entire city begins to emerge from the seabed, one structure and one artifact at a time. Temple foundations. Sphinxes. More than 60 shipwrecks, their timbers still intact in the low-oxygen mud. Hundreds of anchors. Gold coins and ceremonial artifacts scattered across the sediment exactly where they sank. This is Thonis-Heracleion, once Egypt's primary Mediterranean port, a city so central to Egyptian religious and commercial life that its name appeared on official decrees carved in stone, and for over 1,000 years, nobody living knew where it had gone. Thonis-Heracleion, called Thonis in Egyptian sources and Heracleion in Greek ones, served as Egypt's principal gateway for Mediterranean trade before the rise of Alexandria in the 4th century BC, and continued operating as a major religious and commercial center for centuries afterward, even as Alexandria eclipsed it economically. The city centered on a grand temple of Amun-Gareb, where Egyptian pharaohs traveled specifically to receive confirmation of their royal power from the god's resident priests. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described visiting the city himself and recorded local legends already circulating about it even then, including one claiming the Greek hero Heracles had once set foot there, a story detailed and specific enough that some scholars now believe it points to genuine cultural memory of the city's real antiquity rather than pure literary invention. By the time European travelers began seriously searching for it centuries later, Thonis-Heracleion had become little more than a half-remembered name in old texts, its exact location lost so completely that some scholars openly questioned whether Herodotus's account described a real place at all, or simply a convenient literary setting. Here's where it gets strange. The city didn't burn. It wasn't sacked. It sank, gradually, and then not gradually at all, the victim of a phenomenon called soil liquefaction, operating across the soft, waterlogged clay of the Nile Delta. For centuries, the accumulated weight of the city's monumental stone architecture, temples, colossal statues, harbor structures, pressed down on unstable delta soil that periodically gave way beneath it, section by section, in a slow series of localized subsidence events nobody at the time could fully track. Gaudio's team identified evidence of a final, far more dramatic collapse phase around the 8th century AD, potentially triggered by a sudden flood surge or a significant seismic disturbance interacting with delta soil, already destabilized by centuries of gradual sinking. Whatever the exact final trigger, an entire quarter of the city dropped beneath the waterline in what geologists studying the site believe was a rapid, localized event, unfolding over hours, not the slow-motion retreat a population might have had generations to calmly plan around. What makes Thonis-Heracleion different from several sites earlier on this list is the near-total absence of mass casualties in the archaeological record. No significant concentration of human remains has been recovered from the collapsed sections of the city, despite extensive underwater excavation across an area now covering multiple square miles of seabed. A major port city, home to temples, warehouses, and dense residential districts, appears to have avoided a catastrophic death toll even as large sections of it dropped into the sea within a single localized event. The most likely explanation is a population that had already lived with a slowly sinking, unstable coastline for generations, aware enough of the risk, and mobile enough as an active trading port with ships constantly loading and unloading to evacuate a collapsing district before the water closed over it for good. That explanation, however, remains an inference built from an absence of bodies, not from any surviving account of the evacuation itself. Excavation of Thonis-Heracleion continues today, coordinated by Gaudio's team with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, recovering artifacts at a pace that has kept the site actively worked for more than 2 decades, without approaching full documentation of everything down there. Recovered items include a 16-foot granite statue of the Nile flood god Hapi, dozens of sarcophagi believed to have once held mummified animals, and lead tablets inscribed with contracts and religious dedications, ordinary bureaucratic paperwork from a city that had no idea it was working against a clock. Nearby, the associated city of Canopus suffered a strikingly similar submerged fate, suggesting this entire stretch of coastline was quietly losing the same battle with unstable delta soil for centuries, before anyone alive at the time fully understood what was happening beneath their own harbors and temple floors. The sea took Thonis-Heracleion by inches, over long centuries, until the inches became feet all at once, and even then, almost everyone seems to have gotten out. The last place on this list didn't get that kind of mercy. Its ending is the most completely documented catastrophe of all 10, and it still took the modern world 2,000 years to find the body. Number 10. Nineveh. The year is 1847. You're a British excavator named Austin Henry Layard, digging into a massive mound near Mosul called Kuyunjik, and your workers have just broken through into a corridor lined floor to ceiling with carved stone reliefs, kings hunting lions, armies on the march, a city under siege rendered in exact, obsessive architectural detail. You are standing inside the throne room of what will soon be confirmed as Nineveh, once the largest and richest city on earth, capital of an empire that at its height ruled from Egypt to Iran, and for more than 2,000 years its exact location, its scale, and its full identity had to be pieced back together from ruins, rubble, and the memory of a single catastrophic season that ended it in what may have been a matter of weeks. Nineveh became the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire under King Sennacherib in the early 7th century BC, and under his successors it grew into a metropolis of staggering scale for its era, protected by roughly 7.5 miles of double fortification walls punctuated by more than a dozen monumental gates, home to elaborate palace complexes decorated with room after room of narrative stone relief carvings, and host to the great library of King Ashurbanipal, an archive of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets covering medicine, astronomy, literature, law, and administration. The single largest collection of written knowledge assembled anywhere in the ancient world up to that point. Assyrian military campaigns had made the empire feared and resented across the entire Near East for generations, extracting tribute and crushing rebellions with a brutality. The empire's own palace reliefs proudly documented in carved stone for visitors to see, including detailed depictions of mass deportations, flayings, and impalements, presented not as shameful acts but as evidence of royal power. Here's where it gets strange, in that for once, nothing about this ending is mysterious at all. In 612 BC, a coalition of the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nabopolassar, the Medes under Cyaxares, and allied Scythian forces besieged Nineveh, and after a siege lasting roughly 3 months, breached the walls, reportedly aided by flooding from the Tigris and Kosser rivers that undermined sections of the fortifications, and destroyed the city so completely that it never functioned as a major capital again. The event is documented in the Babylonian Chronicle, a contemporary cuneiform historical record maintained by Assyria's own enemies, and it echoes forward into the Hebrew Bible, where the entire Book of Nahum is an extended prophecy celebrating the specific, total destruction of Nineveh as divine justice for the empire's cruelty. Excavation confirmed the violence in the ground itself: burned palace floors, collapsed fortifications, arrowheads embedded in doorways, and Ashurbanipal's library scattered and shattered across multiple rooms, its tens of thousands of tablet fragments accidentally preserved for the modern world. For the same reason Ugarit's and Pylos's final records survived, because the fire that destroyed the building around them baked the clay hard enough to outlast 3 more millennia in the rubble. What sets Nineveh apart from everywhere else on this list is the scale of the erasure that followed a fall this well documented. The Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful and feared political entities in the ancient world, essentially ceased to exist as a political force within a few years of the city's fall. Its remaining territory carved up between the victorious Babylonians and Medes almost immediately. Nineveh itself was left in ruins, stripped and picked over by its conquerors, never rebuilt as an imperial capital, and while a small population and, eventually, a shrine on part of the mound persisted through later centuries, the identity, the true scale, and the specific history of the city faded from precise knowledge outside of scattered, classical, and biblical references. It took Layard's mid-19th century excavations, followed by his assistant Hormuzd Rassam's continued work recovering the library tablets, to confirm definitively that the mounds outside Mosul, one of them, still crowned by a shrine venerated locally as the tomb of the prophet Jonah, were in fact the remains of the city the ancient world had once called the greatest on earth. How does an empire that dominated the known world for nearly 3 centuries collapse this completely, this fast, leaving a library of tens of thousands of tablets to be scattered in the dirt for 2.5 millennia? What did the coalition that finally brought Nineveh down understand about the empire's weaknesses that generations of previous rebels hadn't? And knowing that Assyria's own carved reliefs celebrated the same kind of total, deliberate destruction it eventually suffered itself, is that irony, justice, or simply how empires this size have always ended? 10 places. 10 different populations who built something extraordinary and then lost every bit of it, fast, to fire, water, earthquake, siege, or the people standing closest to them, leaving behind exactly enough evidence for us to reconstruct the horror without ever fully explaining it away. Some of them tried to warn us themselves, in letters that never got sent and tablets that were never meant to survive the flames that ended up preserving them. If you want to keep finding out what's still buried, subscribe. Leave a comment with which of these 10 sites unsettles you the most, and tell us where you're watching from.